She thought her wealth could bend centuries of tradition, but one royal guard showed her that respect isn't bought, it's earned. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you believe some values, like honor, service, and dignity, should never go out of style, hit that like button, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss tomorrow's powerful story of courage at Buckingham Palace. The spring sun bathed Buckingham Palace in a soft golden light, casting long shadows across its regal grounds. Tourists posed, marveled, and snapped photos, until one voice shattered the peace. Charlotte Wexley had arrived. Wrapped in couture and entitlement, Charlotte marched straight to the palace gates, high heels clacking with indignation. "I need a private photo with one of the guards," she declared, flashing her influencer badge like a royal decree. "Make an exception. I'm American media." A palace staff member, calm and courteous, gently explained, "I'm sorry, ma'am, visiting hours have ended." Charlotte's smile faded into a scowl. "Do you know who I am?" she demanded. "I can triple your exposure just with one reel." But protocol does not bow to privilege. When rules held firm, her frustration found a new target. A silent, stone-still royal guard standing nearby. She turned toward him with a grin that wasn't friendly. She didn't know it yet, but she was about to learn a lesson in dignity, the kind no spotlight can outshine. When privilege meets protocol, something always gives. And in Charlotte Wexley's case, it wasn't going to be the guard. Still reeling from being told no, Charlotte stormed across the palace forecourt, her heels slicing the silence like daggers on marble. Tourists parted like waves before her, their gazes following her with that unmistakable mix of curiosity and concern. Her camera assistant trailed nervously behind, still recording. Charlotte's eyes locked onto Corporal Edward Langford. There he stood, motionless, a living statue in scarlet red, black bearskin hat, white gloves, and a ceremonial rifle that gleamed under the sun. He didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't even glance her way. To Charlotte, that silence was the ultimate insult. She marched right up, planted herself in front of him, and spoke in the same clipped, commanding voice she used on waiters who forgot her extra lemon. "Excuse me? Hello?" She waved a manicured hand inches from his face. "Can you hear me?" "Yes, you, the one pretending to be a mannequin." Langford remained still. Charlotte let out a dramatic sigh and turned to her camera. "Folks, this is the kind of hospitality you get here." "I'm literally being ignored by a man in costume, no less." She turned back, now invading his space fully. "Look, I get it. You're doing the whole statue thing. Very traditional, very British. But some of us," she paused for effect, "actually matter." The tourists around began whispering. A few older visitors shook their heads. One child tugged at his mother's sleeve and asked, "Why is that lady yelling at the soldier?" Charlotte didn't notice. Or didn't care. "You think standing there makes you important?" she hissed. "I sell homes bigger than this palace. I could buy and sell your entire salary with one commission check." Her voice grew louder, harsher. "I'm not some peasant here on a school trip. I fly first class. I sit on boards. I get invited to the White House Christmas party. You think I'm gonna let a guy in a funny hat stand in my way?" Still nothing. And that silence, it drove her mad. Because to someone like Charlotte Wexley, silence wasn't professionalism, it wasn't discipline, it was defiance. "You people always hide behind rules and uniforms because you don't know how to handle real success," she snapped. She circled Langford, her expensive perfume hanging thick in the spring air. "Do you even have a real job, or is this it? Playing dress-up for tourists?" Edward Langford, of course, had served 3 combat deployments. He had led aid convoys through mine-ridden roads in Syria. He had watched friends fall. He had written letters home for soldiers who would never return. But right now, he stood for something bigger than himself, for service without ego, for honor without applause. Charlotte jabbed a finger at his chest. "Say something! Are you too scared or just too stuck up?" Still no response. But somewhere in the stillness of the courtyard, something shifted. Not in Langford's body, but in the atmosphere. A tension, a weight, as if history itself was holding its breath. She'd mistaken silence for submission. But what she didn't know, what she was about to learn, was that true strength doesn't need to raise its voice. It simply stands and endures. What began as arrogance was now teetering on the edge of disrespect. Charlotte Wexley had tried everything: charm, threats, influence. None of it had worked. The royal guard still hadn't flinched, blinked, or acknowledged her in any way. To someone who measured importance by how quickly the world responded, this silence was intolerable. She paced in front of him now like a lioness in a gilded cage, her heels cracking against the stone like distant gunfire. "Unbelievable," she muttered, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "They let these people wear medals like it means something. Probably got it for standing still the longest." Gasps rippled through the courtyard. The medal in question, glinting proudly on Corporal Edward Langford's chest, was no decoration. It was a Distinguished Service Cross, awarded for bravery during a rescue mission in Syria. He had dragged 2 wounded comrades out of a burning convoy while under enemy fire. But Charlotte didn't know that. Or perhaps she didn't care. She stepped closer, too close. Tourists murmured, some raised their phones. One older man in a blazer bearing a small poppy pin whispered to his wife, "She's about to do something very foolish." And then she did. With a flick of her wrist, Charlotte reached out and tugged at the medal pinned to Langford's tunic. It was quick, almost casual, but to the onlookers it was a violent act. Not of the hand, but of the heart. The sound it made was soft, a muted metallic jingle, but it cracked across the air like thunder. Langford didn't move. His posture remained flawless, as if he hadn't just been touched, disrespected, provoked. But the silence was no longer empty, it was charged, like the seconds before a storm breaks. Charlotte held the medal between 2 fingers and scoffed. "This what you're so proud of? Some souvenir?" A child in the crowd started crying. His father, a U.S. Army vet on holiday, pulled him close and whispered, "That's not something you touch, son. That's something you earn." Charlotte turned to the growing crowd. "All this over a little pin? Really? Are you people that uptight?" She laughed, awkward, forced, but no one joined her. Because everyone recognized what she had just done. She hadn't insulted a man. She had insulted every soldier who'd ever worn a uniform, every family who'd ever lost a son or daughter in service. Every tradition built not on ego but on sacrifice. Langford slowly, carefully lifted his eyes to meet hers. And for the first time that day, Charlotte froze. There was no anger in his gaze, no hatred, just a calm, focused stare. The kind carried by men who've seen the worst of humanity and chosen dignity over destruction. And in that gaze, Charlotte saw something terrifyingly unfamiliar. As conviction, not the kind that makes noise, the kind that stands unshaken no matter what the world throws at it. Her fingers loosened, the medal slipped from her grasp. It hit the ground with a soft clink, but in that single sound, something broke. Not in him, but in her. The medal struck the stone courtyard with a soft clink. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Charlotte Wexley stood frozen, her fingers still curled in the air as if unsure of what they'd just done. The tourists around her, once mere observers, now became witnesses, their phones lowered, their eyes locked. Even the birds in the trees seemed to still. Corporal Edward Langford lowered his gaze. It wasn't anger that filled his face, it was something deeper, stillness sharpened by sorrow, calm forged in sacrifice. He bent down, picked up the medal with gloved fingers, and pinned it back to his chest with reverent care. Then, for the first time since she had begun her tirade, he spoke. His voice was low, steady, the kind of voice that doesn't need to shout because it carries the weight of truth. "I received that medal in Syria," he began, eyes still fixed on the badge she'd touched. "It was pinned to me by the mother of a man who never made it home." Charlotte blinked. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Langford continued, turning his gaze directly to hers. "He was 23, just a kid. His name was Thomas. He jumped on an IED to save our unit. I held his hand as he bled out. That medal isn't for me, it's for him." A murmur swept through the crowd. Somewhere someone let out a quiet, trembling sigh. Langford stood taller, though his voice remained calm. "I stand here in this uniform not to be photographed, not to entertain tourists, but to honor men like Thomas. To represent centuries of service, of those who stood their ground, not for applause, but for duty." Charlotte looked down, but he wasn't finished. "When you touched this badge," he said gently, "you didn't insult me. You insulted every man and woman who's worn this red. You mocked the pain of families who never got to welcome their sons home. You mistook tradition for costume and silence for weakness." There was no judgment in his tone, only clarity, only truth. "You think this is a role I play?" he asked, tapping his chest. "I've bled for this. I've lost brothers for this. And I'd do it all again, not for glory, but because some things in this world are still worth standing for." Charlotte's cheeks flushed red. Her voice cracked. I didn't know." Langford nodded slightly. "No, you didn't." From the edge of the crowd, an elderly man stepped forward. His coat was lined with faded ribbons. A silver pin in the shape of a poppy glinted on his lapel. "2 tours in the Falklands," the man said, his voice gravelly, "and I've never heard it said better." The old veteran turned to Charlotte. "Miss, you thought you were confronting a man in costume, but what you really confronted was the soul of a nation, carried on the shoulders of the quiet few who serve it." Charlotte's designer handbag slipped from her arm. For the first time, her posture sagged, not from defeat, but from the weight of self-realization. Langford adjusted his gloves, his stance returning to form, but something had changed. He wasn't just a figure in red anymore. He was the embodiment of everything she had failed to understand. "It's easy to shout when you've never been silenced by loss," he said softly. "Easy to demand when you've never been denied something worth dying for." He paused, then added, not unkindly, "But perhaps now you'll understand the difference between influence and impact." The crowd stood in reverent stillness. No one applauded, no one cheered, because moments like this don't call for noise. They call for respect. Charlotte, shaken to her core, slowly picked up her bag and stepped back. Her voice, once the loudest in the square, was now silent, not out of shame, but reflection. And as she melted into the crowd, one truth lingered. The strongest words ever spoken are the ones earned in silence. The silence hung heavy in the courtyard. Corporal Edward Langford had just spoken, not with fury, but with the dignity of a man who'd lived through war and returned with more than scars. His words had landed not just on Charlotte, but on every soul watching. And then, from among the quiet crowd, the old veteran stepped forward again. His gait was slow but steady. His coat, weathered by years, still bore the proud shimmer of campaign ribbons, and a silver poppy pinned over his heart. His presence, even in stillness, commanded respect. He turned to Charlotte. Her eyes, once blazing with entitlement, now flickered with something far rarer: awareness. The veteran looked at her, not with anger, but with the quiet strength of someone who had watched people learn the hardest truths in the hardest ways. "You lady," he began, his voice rough like gravel smoothed by time. "You came here today, thinking this place was about photos, souvenirs, and content. But this place, this uniform, it isn't about looking grand. It's about remembering what real service looks like. Charlotte lowered her eyes, but he continued, not to shame her, but to teach. That man you tried to humiliate, he's stood in places that don't make headlines. He's protected people who will never know his name. You see a fancy coat, I see a shield, a promise made by generations who stood before him and who will come after. He glanced briefly at Langford, then back at her. You touched a medal you didn't earn. You mocked a silence you didn't understand. And for a moment you forgot that the world doesn't revolve around influence. It turns because of sacrifice. The words hung there like a sermon in sacred space. Then he did something unexpected. The veteran slowly unbuttoned his coat and revealed his own row of medals. Some faded, some gleaming. He reached up, unclipped one, a dull bronze cross, and stepped forward. Even Langford, ever disciplined, tilted his head in subtle surprise. "This was given to me after the Falklands," the veteran said. "It's not worth much to anyone else, but to me, it's a reminder of the day I came back, and my friend didn't." He extended his hand, the medal resting gently in his palm. Charlotte instinctively stepped back, unsure what to do. "I'm not giving this to you," he said. "Not because you don't deserve it, but because you haven't earned it." There was no cruelty in his tone, just truth. "But I want you to hold it, just for a moment. Feel its weight." Hesitantly, Charlotte reached out. Her fingers brushed the surface of the medal. It was heavier than she expected. "Now imagine," the veteran said, "carrying that weight every day, not for what it's made of, but for who it represents." She nodded slowly, eyes beginning to mist. "It's not too late to understand," he added softly. "You've been given a chance few get, to be humbled without being harmed, to listen rather than shout, to see rather than pose." Charlotte looked up. Her voice, when it came, was small but sincere. I didn't know." The veteran nodded. "Now you do." He took back the medal, reclipped it to his chest, and with a quiet motion, saluted Langford. Langford returned the salute not as a formality, but as a bond between warriors. From the crowd, a ripple of respect swept through. One by one, tourists began to nod, some placing hands over their hearts, others simply standing in quiet solidarity. Charlotte turned to Langford. "I'm sorry," she said, not to earn forgiveness, but because she finally meant it. Langford didn't reply. He didn't need to. His silence had already said everything. In a courtyard built on tradition, a woman who thought she owned the world learned that true power isn't in being seen, but in standing for something bigger than yourself. Sometimes it takes a still soldier and a worn medal to remind us of the values that hold a nation together. The courtyard had gone still, not with discomfort, but reverence. Charlotte Wexley stood silently between a decorated veteran and a royal guard who had just shown the world the quiet power of discipline. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from realization. A pair of uniformed officers approached the scene. One was a middle-aged man with years etched around his eyes. The other, a woman with gray streaks in her hair and the calm demeanor of someone who had seen humanity at its best and worst. They didn't rush. They didn't bark orders. They very technically reconciled They simply stopped beside Charlotte and spoke in voices meant not to escalate but to restore order. "Ma'am," the woman said gently, "we're going to ask you to step aside with us." Charlotte nodded. No protests, no theatrics, just quiet compliance. The male officer added, "Assaulting a member of His Majesty's Armed Forces is a serious offense, but considering the circumstances, we'll let the palace decide the next steps." Langford remained at attention, impeccable, still, but something in his posture now carried the gravity of the moment. He wasn't just a guard, he had become the conscience of the crowd. As Charlotte was led a few steps away, a small child, perhaps no more than 8, tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad," he whispered, "why didn't the soldier hit her back?" The father, a man with soft eyes and a veteran's bearing, knelt beside him. "Because, son," he said, "real strength isn't about hitting, it's about knowing when not to." That answer seemed to echo louder than any reprimand. Charlotte turned her head at that moment. Her eyes found the boy and something shifted in her face. Not just embarrassment, but the first stirrings of understanding. The officers escorted her toward the edge of the courtyard, not in disgrace, but in quiet accountability. And the crowd? They didn't cheer. They watched, many with hand over heart, others with heads bowed, as a lesson unfolded not just in silence, but in... The elderly veteran remained for a moment longer, standing beside Langford in quiet solidarity. Then he gave a final nod of respect and turned to walk away, his campaign medals glinting one last time in the fading sunlight. Langford resumed his post. His cheek, once marked, now bore no sign of the slap, but his bearing and the meaning behind it would linger long after the tourists had gone home. We live in a world that often celebrates loud voices, quick tempers, and viral reactions, but sometimes, just sometimes, it's the silent ones who speak the loudest. Today, a royal guard didn't just stand his ground. He stood for something greater, for history, for sacrifice, for every soldier who served without ever asking to be seen. When Charlotte Wexley came to Buckingham Palace looking for a photo, she left with a mirror, because in one unforgettable moment, she didn't just see a soldier, she saw herself. And so did we. Now it's your turn. What would you have done in that situation? Could you have stood still in the face of mockery? Would you have held your discipline, your dignity, when no one else would? We want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. On a scale of 1 to 10, how powerful was this story for you? Did it stir something inside you, perhaps a memory, a value, or a sense of pride in those who serve? If this story reminded you why tradition matters, why service still means something, and why respect should never go out of style, give this video a like. Subscribe to our channel for more true-to-life stories where dignity defeats ego and silence roars louder than any insult. And don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss the next chapter in our series on Royal Guards, where valor meets ceremony. Because in a world chasing noise, we believe it's time to slow down and listen to the ones who stand without needing to speak. This has been another story where character was tested and honor stood tall.